The sound of pages turning means it's time for another episode from the Meredith Library podcast studio, bringing you the library's latest news, information, and fun.
Good afternoon, Anna.
Good afternoon, Matthew.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to episode number 31 of Check It Out here on the Meredith Library podcast studio. Today, we have a special guest in studio with us, Anna.
We love having guests. This is so exciting.
It is, and he's going to tell us all kinds of fun stuff today about himself, about a program that perhaps is our most popular program here at the library.
Yes, with one of the most popular writers of all time.
Let's not keep the audience in suspense any longer. Welcome, John Lin.
And the most popular English writer of all time is...
Shakespeare!
Shakespeare. Wonderful.
All right, let's get right into our questions for our guest today, Anna.
Yes, John. So, first of all, we wanted to know a little bit about your background. I've heard that you were an English teacher, but I don't know anything else besides that. So, did you want to talk about how you got into it, how long you taught?
Well, maybe I should start at the beginning, or I could start at the end and then go back to the beginning. But the beginning that is important, I think, is that I was a terrible English student in high school. And I tell my high school English students that all the time to motivate them and inspire them to recognize that even though at one stage of one's life you might not be interested in something, later on a lot can change. So I almost flunked out of English in high school, if that's possible. And then I went on to college thinking I was going to be a doctor. So I was pre-med for a while, and until the biology teacher told me that I should probably find another major. And then I thought that philosophy would be interesting because I had never taken a philosophy course before. So I started philosophy, declared philosophy as a major, and realized that I liked philosophy for reading of philosophy, but I didn't understand philosophy. And at the same time, I was taking required English courses, but I was a very late declared English major. So I took a lot of English courses my junior and senior year, and that really launched me into knowing more about English literature and American literature, mostly English literature. And the more I knew, the more interested I became in the subject. So then I ended up getting a master's degree. Over the summers, Middlebury College has a program at their Breadloaf campus, Breadloaf School of English. And so in 4 summers, I was able to get a master's degree there.
So were you already teaching during the school years?
I was teaching at the Taft School in Connecticut because I was teaching English and doing admissions work. They paid for my master's degree as part of professional development.
All right, that's
so
good.
That was really nice.
We love when that happens.
Yeah, isn't that nice? And then while I was doing my Breadloaf degree, they have a program where you can go to Oxford University for a summer. They have a campus at Lincoln College in Oxford. And while I was there one summer, one of my 4 summers, I was taught in a Shakespeare course, a Shakespeare history plays course by a gentleman named John Wilders, who was the Dean of Graduate Studies at the university. He was chair of the English faculty there, and he was also dean for graduates at one of the colleges in Oxford. We kept up a correspondence after this class, and after I graduated from Middlebury, he asked if I wanted to continue my studies in Oxford with him. And I said, sure. So after 3 years of working, teaching English, I decamped across the pond to England for 3 more years and worked with Professor Wilders and studied Shakespeare and the drama to 1660 when the theaters closed. So,
wow, that's amazing. So were you actually teaching in England as well at that time? Or
no,
you
I
only
was
studying?
a full-time student, which was wonderful. And if
Wow.
you could be a full-time student, there are ways you could find to be a student much longer than you actually should be a student. But it was delightful. Oxford is less than an hour northwest of London and 40 minutes from Stratford. And so I was able to go see Shakespeare's plays at Royal Shakespeare Company. I had a car, and you could go there and watch a play for £5 at that time. This was in the 80s. I could go get the best seat in the house for £5. And anyway, I'd drive up there after dinner. It'd be in the summertime, beautiful sunset. And I'd walk up, get my 5-pound ticket, and afterwards I'd have a meal with some of the actors in the Dirty Duck pub where they all gathered in costume sometimes and with full makeup on. They hustled right out of the theater into the pub for a pint. And anyway, it was a wonderful 3 years there.
Oh, that's so fascinating.
And most recently, I was teaching English at the Holderness School. And after 14 years there, I retired. My wife still teaches English there, and she will retire at the end of this year. So we'll be a couple of retired English teachers living in Meredith.
Yeah, I didn't know that you were in England and studied Shakespeare there. I feel like people in England are much more serious about Shakespeare. I feel like the education there must have been really, really robust.
Well, robust is a good word for it. We talked a little bit before about any controversies around Shakespeare, and there aren't very many except the authorship question. And so we recently, in our little seminar here, talked about the Shakespeare authorship question, and there have been some books recently published that speculate that maybe a woman had written Shakespeare's plays, at least some of them. And lots of arguments for that. You could find the arguments for various other people who may have written Shakespeare's plays. But the argument against Shakespeare is interesting just because the anti-Shakespeare folks don't think that a man of such humble background, having only like a middle school, grammar school education, could have been so widely educated and widely read and have insight into the running of the royal court. Lots of his history plays, they chronicle the wide movement of a kingship and battles won and lost, but they also investigate sort of intimate moments within the court itself, the jealousies, the relationships between brothers, husbands and wives, fathers and children. And so how somebody from Stratford would have any insight into how those people operated is something that is, I think, a mark of Shakespeare's genius, that he could understand how humans behave, whether you are of royalty or of peasant stock. And he understood humans, and I think ultimately that's what makes his plays and the themes of his plays enduring.
It's interesting because it makes you think then when you're hearing your explanation like that, was he being historically accurate, or did he just do such a good job, like you said, understanding the human condition, that people reading it now are thinking that, oh, well, yes, this is what really happened in the royal family. Maybe he just made us believe that's what happened.
You raised the question about historical accuracy. And I think, even today, when we read news from 5 years ago, what's historically accurate? You could probably find conflicting accounts of this exact same event. And so the same is true of events that took place in Shakespeare's time, but also as they were written about after his time, people had a bias. And whether you were a member of this party or that party, in today's language, whether you're of that royal house or that royal lineage or that one, you had some vested interest in portraying a character in a particular way or not. I think one of the most interesting cases that we studied was Richard III, Duke of Gloucester. And at the end of the War of the Roses, he's a York. And so he's portrayed as a villain because at the time that Shakespeare wrote this play, the Lancastrian branch of that war was in power. Anyway, it's interesting that people now can see that play as perhaps propaganda as opposed to accurate depiction.
Yeah, and history and myth-making have a very close relationship with each other, right? And like you said, propaganda. And that's what's really cool about English, I think, as a subject, is that the stories that people tell about a certain time period communicate attitudes at the time and communicate those beliefs. And so when you can look at it and say, okay, let's contextualize this. Who wrote it? From where? What perspective? And what does that say? So that's a really great thing about, I think, English just in general, and why the classics are still relevant and why they're still studied.
So that gives us a really good background and shows us your enthusiasm for Shakespeare, definitely. And all right, Anna, what do you have next?
I kind of wanted to ask about teaching Shakespeare when you were doing that with high schoolers. If you found that teaching that sparked a certain thing in students, like were the plays particularly successful, or in your curriculum, did you teach them routinely?
There was a time earlier, even at Thatcher, but there was a time earlier in my teaching career where Shakespeare and British writers in general featured more largely in the curriculum. what has happened, I think, is that for American students who may not read as much as they should read, in order to get them to read, the focus has shifted from more challenging texts from long ago and far away in language that they immediately think is Old English. That that's not Old English. That's not quite old enough. I could show you Old English and you definitely would not be able to read it. Nor is it Middle English. It is just a different kind of English than they're used to. So the shift, at least in my own teaching, has been to do fewer British texts and more American texts, and even shorter texts and less challenging texts. So once when Shakespeare, you'd read one or two Shakespeare plays in any given year in high school. When I first arrived at Holderness, we did a Shakespeare play a year. Now there's no required Shakespeare.
Well, that's unfortunate that Shakespeare has fallen out of high school curriculum generally. I know that a lot of adults have positive memories of doing Shakespeare's plays in high school and maybe even college. And I feel like that's what your group really offers here at the Meredith Public Library, is sort of an opportunity to spend time with Shakespeare again, or maybe get introduced to him for the first time. So do you want to tell us a little bit about your group here?
Absolutely. It's been one of the joys of my retirement, and completely unplanned in this way. I thought we were going to do one, maybe two sessions when I wrote to Erin right after I retired. It wasn't that I had any regret about not teaching high schoolers anymore, but I loved teaching, and I wondered how I would be able to continue teaching. And so a book group came up in my head, and I wrote to Erin, and she wrote right back to me and said, we can run this and see if it would fly. And so we started with Hamlet, which is a play I ended with. And so it was fresh in my mind, and I had all these ideas and more things to talk about regarding the play. And the first meeting down in the conference room, we had 20-some people show up, and it really sort of flabbergasted me. I was taken aback for a moment. I didn't know why all these people might be interested in Shakespeare and reading Hamlet. They stayed to the end of the reading of the play. We do one act of a Shakespeare play a week.
Is that how it was that first time too?
Yes.
Okay.
So one act a week, which is a manageable amount of reading to do. And so we hadn't settled on all kinds of logistical things, like which edition of the play we're going to use. The first year and a half, it was all discussion based. There were a few PowerPoint slideshows. There were some illustrations of genealogy of who's related to whom and how these people got to be enemies. Then, asking the group for feedback, they wanted to see more productions, and many of them hadn't seen a lot of productions. And because these productions were available, we started showing films. So now, for instance, with The Winter's Tale, which we're doing now, we just started last week, the play hadn't come in yet. The book hadn't come in. We watched the Royal Shakespeare Company production of the play Act 1. We sometimes watch several versions of the same scene.
Then you can compare and contrast, as you like to say in English class.
Yes, exactly. So we do a lot of reading out loud, and so we want to get the words and the texts in our bodies. We want to feel how saying these words sound to somebody else. If you're in an argument with them, what does that sound like? What does that feel like to say these words as a father to a son?
And have you noticed over time that the participants are more comfortable with that kind of language, having to speak that out loud, since it's not the same way we express ourselves today?
So much more. So much more comfortable. And sometimes, so I will play the video with subtitles sometimes. And so they'll just publish the play text right underneath. And sometimes they get it really wrong. It's kind of humorous. But for the most part, it's accurate play text. So they can read and follow along as they hear and see. And recently I've turned off the subtitles and said, look, if we were at the theater, there are no subtitles. So if we go to the theater, are you going to be able to understand this? And I think that over the time we've spent with the language and with his plays, that there's a growing familiarity, certainly. There are always words that we don't know, and humor that we don't get and references that are so obscure that we can't even tease out what he's talking about. But it doesn't affect the overall more global effect of the play on us as readers and viewers of Shakespeare.
If someone was to want to join, do they need to have any background in Shakespeare to be a part of this group?
Absolutely not. You just have to be willing to read and to come every Wednesday at 1:00 to the conference room. And so we try to limit to an hour and a half, but it's a full hour and a half. And not only are people becoming more familiar with the language of Shakespeare, but they're becoming much more comfortable with speaking out loud. It's like in any classroom, you have students who are more active participants than others. And now I feel that everyone feels comfortable speaking out loud, even people who may not have spoken very much in the first year of our being together are now speaking regularly in the class, which I think is great.
It is great. Well, that speaks to the atmosphere that you create as the instructor or the leader too. So I think that's a good compliment to you as well.
Well, thank you. And I think that people find a warm welcome and a group that understands that each of us comes from our own backgrounds of knowing or not knowing things, and that we are not there to judge or to show off anything about our backgrounds. We're here to share our interest and enthusiasm for this writing and a particular play and a particular act of a play each week.
Can people join in the middle, or would you recommend starting at the beginning of a new play?
It's hard to join in the middle. If you want to read up to the point where we're discussing, you can join at any time. The dates are published on the library's website, although they might be altered or changed along the way because of things that happen in life to all of us. They are scheduled, again, 5 weeks. Every Shakespeare play is 5 acts long, so it takes you 5 weeks to get through a play.
And the information is definitely out there, as you said. We talk about it on the podcast, of course. It's in the newspaper column. It is also on the website, sometimes on the front page. In the newsletter Erin sends out twice a month.
And the books are available at the front desk for purchase. They're $5.
They were originally free, and again, through the generosity of the Friends of the Library. But then because we were expending so much of the funds, it became clear to the librarians that we needed to charge for these books. So that's how come there became a cost that was involved of $5, which accounts for about half of the price of this. So the Friends in the library still subsidizes half the price of these books, which of course you get to keep and annotate.
I know, and they become cool artifacts of the class in and of itself, which is really fun as well. This concludes part 1 of our interview with John Lin about his Shakespeare program at the Meredith Public Library. Stay tuned in 2 weeks when we will release the second part of this episode, and we will talk more about Shakespeare and have some surprise bonus content.
Sounds like we're at the end of another chapter. Podcast music titled Daytime TV Theme by Kevin MacLeod of Incompetech.com. Licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 4.0. Podcast copyright 2024. Meredith Library Podcast Studio.